the first burst over Guadalcanal. On 5th January 1943, just after dawn off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the sea is a sheet of hammered steel under a low bruised sky, and the light cruiser USS Helena, CL-50, rides the swells with that restless metallic groan that never quite lets a sailor forget the ship is alive. Salt spray snaps against the shields of the 5-inch 38 mounts as Lieutenant Red Cochrane, eyes gritty, throat raw from night air and cordite, stands in the aft battery control position, listening to the ship's loudspeakers crackle with clipped voices from Combat Information Center, the kind of voices that sound calm only because fear has been drilled into procedure, because a few hours earlier Helena and the rest of Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth's cruiser force had been hurling thousands of shells into the darkness toward Munda, and now the ships are turning back toward the anchorage at Guadalcanal to refuel, to rearm, to do it all again. Above the aft superstructure, the air stinks of exhaust and burned powder, and somewhere forward, deck crews are starting the careful work of recovering float planes, cranes creaking as cables tighten, routine returning like a thin layer of paint over the memory of flak and muzzle blast, when a sharper voice cuts through, "Raid incoming!" Bearing, and the numbers follow too fast for anyone not trained to catch them. But Cochrane doesn't need the whole sentence, because the men around him have already shifted from fatigue to focus, hands finding levers, shoes braced wide on a deck that won't stop moving. He feels the ship's vibration change as the Mark 37 director slews, as radar, SC and fire control sets with their ghostly stuttering returns, feeds the first hints of targets into the system, and down in the gunhouse crews stand shoulder to shoulder in hot, cramped steel, waiting for orders that will come as if from nowhere. Stand by, load. The ammunition hoists clatter, and a shell rises into view, 5 inches of steel that looks no different from the thousands they've fired before, except the men who handle it have been told, in the quietest possible way, that these rounds are special, that the fuse in the nose is not to be discussed, not to be described in letters home, not even to be named, on an open deck where a loose word might travel. The secrecy sits in the gun mount like a second crewman, watching, because the weapon inside that shell is new enough that no one fully trusts it, and important enough that the Navy fears what happens if one falls into enemy hands. Cochrane has heard the whispered nickname, VT, for variable time, and the other one, half joking and half reverent, the magic shell, a shell that doesn't merely pass through the sky hoping to meet an airplane, but hunts the air around it, listening for the presence of metal and flesh at hundreds of miles per hour. You can feel the skepticism in the gun crews. Gunners are superstitious, but they are also practical, men who count results in splashes and smoke trails. And yet when the first dark shapes appear through broken cloud, the doubt turns instantly into adrenaline, because these are not distant specks on a map. They are Japanese Ichidi-3A Val dive bombers, slipping in fast, low enough, that you can almost imagine the pilot's goggles, their wings rocking as they pick targets in the American formation. The alarm bells begin to clang, and in the seconds before firing, time stretches the way it always does in combat, filling with tiny, unbearable details. The glint of water on the gun barrel, the taste of copper on the tongue, the thin squeal of bearings as the mount trains. "Commence firing!" Up comes the order, and the aft 5-inch guns answer with a concussion that hits the body like a shove, the blast flattening sound for a heartbeat before it returns louder, harsher, layered with the mechanical rhythm of loading and ramming. The first salvo climbs out in a tight pattern, white traces from smaller guns knitting the air around it, and then the Vals are diving, sirens in their own machines screaming as they fall, bombs releasing with that sickening, lazy drop that seems impossible until the water erupts. A plume rises near one cruiser, then another, and someone yells that the New Zealand cruiser Achilles has been hit, the kind of shouted report that carries no details, only consequence. The Vals pull out and begin to run, turning away from the formation as if to vanish back into cloud, And in older fights, the barrage would follow them as a desperate gesture. Timed fuses set by guesswork, shells bursting too early or too late, fragments shredding empty sky. But today, Cochrane watches the range and bearing settle, watches the director hold, and feels the moment arrive when the new shell is no longer a rumor in a locked crate, but a decision made in real time. VT rounds, fire. But comes there's some, and the hoists feed them up. The loaders handle them carefully. The breech closes with a metallic finality, and the gunhouse becomes pure function. The second of 3 salvos leaves the barrels, and the sky ahead of the fleeing dive bomber suddenly blossoms. Not a distant puff behind it, not a harmless burst above, but a tight, brutal airburst, close enough that even from the ship you can see the effect. The plane jolts, a wing shudders, and a smear of smoke trails out as if the aircraft has been unstitched. The Val begins to fall, not gracefully, but with the ugly certainty of a machine that has lost something essential. And the men on Helena, men who have watched too many attackers limp away, stare as the bomber drops toward the sea and vanishes in spray. For a second, nobody speaks, because disbelief is its own silence. And then the gun crews erupt in hoarse shouts that are half relief and half awe, as if they've just witnessed a rule of physics change. Cochrane doesn't cheer right away. His mind is already racing ahead, already hearing the implications in the sound of that one very close burst. Because if a shell can do that to a fast-moving aircraft with only a few rounds, then every flak pattern, every defense plan, every odds-on calculation that has been killing ships across the Pacific is about to tilt. And the enemy in the sky may not yet realize that something unseen has just arrived to meet them. The cheers on Helena's gun deck don't last long, because the sky is still full of possibility and the sea still full of enemies. And within minutes, the ship's discipline snaps back into place as if someone has thrown a switch. "Ceasefire! Stand by!" the loudspeaker barks, and the 5-inch crews keep their hands on hot steel, while the Mark 37 director steadies and then slews again, searching for another shape in the haze. Spray drums against the hull, and the column of cruisers and destroyers tightens instinctively, each ship guarding the other's blind spots, while below decks in the plotting rooms and CIC, sailors in sweat-darkened shirts lean over scopes and repeat bearings like prayers. In that tense lull, Commander, and temporary RADM by title in later retellings, William Sterling Parsons, Bureau of Ordnance, a compact figure with a careful way of speaking, moves through Helena's after control spaces with a notebook tucked close. Not like a tourist, but like a man, counting the pulse of something fragile and priceless, because he is here for a reason, and the gunnery officers know it. The special fused projectiles are not just ammunition, they're a test carried out under fire, and it is his job to witness, verify, and carry the story back up the chain before rumor can distort it. Parsons pauses near a talker's station where the gun captain's reports are being relayed, and you can almost feel the ship's collective awareness shift. Men glance at him and then away, as if looking too directly might make the whole secret less secret, while the gunnery officer quietly calls for times, salvo counts, and observed effects, building a picture of the engagement out of fragments. Second of 3 salvos, a very close burst, a diving bomber that had been running out to sea suddenly flaming and falling, the kind of clean result that anti-aircraft crews rarely get to see when they've been firing timed fuse shells set by imperfect estimates. On deck, the soundscape returns in layers, the staccato bark of 20mm Oerlikons easing off, the heavier clank of hoists slowing, the metallic hiss of hydraulic training gear settling. And then comes the second wave's echo, distant and uncertain, more threat than contact, enough to keep everyone tight. The task force presses on toward Guadalcanal, and in the mid-morning light you see what the Japanese were trying to do: interrupt the recovery of float planes, punish the ships while they're busy and vulnerable, turn a routine evolution into a killing ground. Other cruisers in the formation take near misses and damage. No time for names in the moment, only the sight of smoke and a hurried signal lamp message. While Helena remains spared the worst of it, her decks vibrating with speed as the helm answers, the column weaving just enough to throw off aim. And then, as the immediate attack ebbs, the ship falls into that strange post-action state where the body is still in combat, but the mind starts to register what happened, and men begin to realize, with a slow dawning, that they may have just watched the first successful combat use of something that will change the war's arithmetic. Parsons doesn't celebrate. His expression, those who later wrote about him said, was closer to relief than triumph, because he understands the other side of the miracle. If the technology works, it must be protected, and protection means rules that will frustrate commanders and gunners alike. Down in a cramped compartment away from the open deck, a senior officer speaks in the low, practical tone sailors use when they're discussing what cannot be discussed. These fuses are to be treated like gold and like explosives, and more than that, like intelligence. Every round is accounted for, every expenditure recorded, every dud feared, because a single unexploded fuse falling into enemy hands could be picked apart, copied, counted. Later accounts would stress how secrecy shaped doctrine at first, and an edict that effectively restricted use to situations where a dud would vanish into deep water rather than land on enemy-held ground, a rule born from hard lessons about how quickly an opponent can reverse engineer a captured device. And so, even in this moment of success off Guadalcanal, you can sense the leash. Officers talk about special rounds in coded terms. Gun captains are told only what they must know. Even the men who load the shells understand that this is an advantage you don't squander casually, the kind that, once revealed, might prompt the enemy to search for countermeasures, jamming, decoys, anything that could blind a tiny transmitter spinning inside a shell. Parsons' notes fill with the kinds of details that make bureaucracies move. The ship, USS Helena, CL-50, the weapon 5-inch 38, the place near Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the date 5 January 1943, and the decisive sentence shot down a Japanese dive bomber with the second of 3 salvos of VT-fused shells, a sentence that will travel, in guarded channels, from the deck plates to admirals to laboratories and production managers back in the United States, where the fuse's designers have been fighting not only physics, but manufacturing reality, trying to build delicate electronics that can survive a gun launch that slams components with tens of thousands of Gs of acceleration. Long before most sailors ever heard the term proximity fuse, engineers had been hardening vacuum tubes and sealing circuits in shock-resistant compounds, turning something that sounds impossible into something that can be handled by a 19-year-old loader in a pitching gunhouse. On Helena that morning, none of that engineering backstory is spoken aloud, but it's present in every careful motion. The way the ammunition party treats the remaining VT rounds with a kind of reverence. The way a chief petty officer warns a young sailor to keep his mouth shut even when he's excited. The way officers write their reports as if each word might be read by someone who doesn't have clearance. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the human truth of war persists. The knowledge that for once the math tilted toward the defender. That for once, the sky did not belong entirely to the attacker. The task force continues its work. The South Pacific sun climbs higher, and the men of Helena settle back into their stations with a new, uneasy confidence, because they have just seen what happens when a shell doesn't need perfect timing or perfect prediction, only proximity. And in the weeks ahead, that lesson will spread through the fleet like electricity, transforming anti-aircraft fire from hopeful noise into something closer to a net, tightening around any aircraft brave enough to come in close. The fleet's wake stretches behind Guadalcanal like a pale scar on the water as Helena steadies her course and the immediate air threat thins into distance. But the ship's officers do not relax. Reports are already being drafted, times and salvo counts checked against bridge logs, and somewhere in the ship's interior, KPT William S. Deke Parsons keeps writing. because he knows what the gunners just proved will ignite demands across the Pacific the moment the right desks in Washington read the words "shot down." And that is exactly the danger. Success is a hungry thing. It makes admirals ask for more, makes production chiefs promise miracles, makes crews believe a weapon is unstoppable, when in reality, it is still a fragile piece of science crammed into steel and spun at murderous RPM. As Helena rolls gently, Parsons' mind slides backward through the chain that brought those rounds here, not as a tidy history lesson, but as a sequence of rooms, faces, and sleepless nights he can still smell. The sharp ozone tang of high-voltage test rigs at Dahlgren, the chalky dust of machine shops, the thin coffee that tastes like burnt rubber at 0300. 2 years earlier, in 1940, the problem had been as simple and as brutal as the one every anti-aircraft officer knew in his bones. Timed fuses were guesswork, and a fast aircraft was a needle in a sky-sized haystack. So the only way to win was to blanket the air with steel and pray the timing was close enough to shred something vital. Parsons had been a Navy officer among scientists, a liaison between the Bureau of Ordnance and the new research machinery that Vannevar Bush and the National Defense Research Committee were building. And when Merle Tuve's Section T began to push a concept that sounded like lunacy, put a tiny radio set in a shell, make it sense an airplane, detonate at killing distance, Parsons became the kind of man wartime organizations cling to. Technical enough to understand, naval enough to fight for it, stubborn enough to keep the work moving when it failed. In the early days, failure was everywhere. Vacuum tubes shattered under launch forces, solder joints cracked, batteries died. The shell spun so violently it tried to tear its own electronics apart. And all of it had to be built by the tens of thousands, not as lab jewels, but as ordnance that could be tossed into a hoist by a teenager on a pitching deck. To make the dream real, the war had to create a new kind of factory and a new kind of secrecy, compartmentalized enough that few workers knew what they were building, strict enough that the weapon's name could not float into enemy ears, because capture was not theoretical, not in a Pacific where ships were lost and beaches changed hands. When the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory took over the research effort, it became a pressure cooker of engineers and Navy officers chasing a device that had to survive shock, spin, heat, moisture, and the indifferent violence of the sea. The proof they needed arrived before the fleet ever saw it. In August 1942, at sea, drone targets were shot down in succession during live-fire trials aboard the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland. And the reports that came back did what combat reports always do: cut through doubt with numbers, force men to admit the impossible was now repeatable. From there, the race turned industrial. Pilot production became full production, and Parsons watched the pipeline form. Fuses flown across the country, mated to 5-inch 38 shells at a Navy yard, and then shipped in bulk to the South Pacific, because a new weapon is only a rumor until it is in the hands of the crews who need it, stacked in the magazines of ships that will actually be attacked. The decision to send Parsons himself, quietly, without fanfare, was not heroism, it was management by proximity. A weapon this secret, this novel, could not be introduced by memo. It had to be shepherded into the fleet, explained just enough, witnessed, verified, then defended in the bureaucratic knife fight that would follow, because every new system creates its own opposition in supply offices, safety boards, and command staffs. And behind all of it lurked the one nightmare that shaped the first doctrine. A dud VT round landing on enemy-held ground, intact enough for Japanese technicians to pry open and study, turning America's advantage into a brief, expensive spark. That fear hardened into an initial rule so blunt it almost sounded like superstition, use permitted only over water, where misfires would vanish into depth and secrecy would be preserved, and it meant the weapon's early life would be naval, wrapped around fleets and convoys first, even as army gunners elsewhere begged for anything that could thin the air attacks and later the massed ground assaults. On Helena, The men don't know all those committees, all those code names, all those late-night arguments about production yields and failure rates, but they can feel the consequence anyway. The careful tallying of each remaining round, the quiet warnings about loose talk, the way the ship seems to carry an invisible cargo more valuable than fuel or ammunition. And as the cruiser steams toward the next day's work, the magic burst behind them begins to transform into something larger and colder. A policy, a program, a manufacturing tempo, a new expectation that anti-aircraft fire can be decisive rather than merely brave, setting the stage for the moment when this secret, born in laboratories and proven in a single sudden blossom of flak over the Solomons, will be demanded everywhere the enemy comes from the sky. The next hours aboard Helena are not heroic in the way sailors like to tell stories. No flags, no speeches, just the slow grind of resetting a fighting ship after an air attack, the smell of sweat and burnt powder trapped in passageways, and the steady work of writing down what happened before. Memory turns it into myth. Parsons sits with the gunnery officers and the log keeper, pinning the event to hard details. Time of attack, number of aircraft, ammunition expended, the crucial observation that the very close burst came from the second salvo, because the entire case for this secret weapon will be carried in paper, and paper is what moves production, budgets, doctrine. Above them, deckhands lash down gear and check for shrapnel scars, while lookouts keep scanning, because in the Solomons, the sky never stays quiet for long. And when Helena finally clears back toward the safer waters and the larger supply rhythm of the South Pacific, Parsons' private urgency grows sharper, almost physical, because he understands the paradox. The VT fuse has to spread fast enough to matter and stay hidden enough to survive. In Noumea, Admiral William F. Halsey's headquarters is a world of maps and cigarette smoke, of sweat-stained khaki and clipped voices, where decisions about islands and convoys are made with a pencil and a tired hand, and Parsons arrives not as a celebrity, but as a messenger carrying a kind of controlled fire. He's already arranged this chain, fuses flown to a Navy yard to be mated to 5-inch 38 rounds, thousands shipped forward, Helena chosen as the first platform, and himself placed aboard to witness. So now the report must be delivered with the right blend of enthusiasm and caution. Yes, it works, and yes, it cannot be treated like ordinary ammunition. Halsey is a blunt man in a blunt war, but he understands leverage when he sees it. He has watched Japanese air power turn sea lanes into killing grounds, watched ships die because gunners could only throw timed bursts into the sky and hope, and he doesn't need a lecture on electronics to grasp the simple battlefield truth. If an anti-aircraft shell can burst reliably near an aircraft without perfect timing, then the fleet's defensive envelope just thickened overnight. Still, the leash remains, and Parsons makes sure it is spoken aloud. Initial use must be over water, so a dud cannot be captured. The kind of restriction that sounds maddening until you picture an intact fuse lying in mud on an enemy-held beach, pried open by careful hands. Back out at sea, the men who actually pull lanyards and feed hoists feel the change before any official doctrine catches up. Gun captains begin to trust shorter patterns and tighter fire control solutions. The director crews begin to think in terms of close enough rather than perfectly timed. Because with VT, you don't need to place the burst precisely in space. You need to place the shell near enough for its own internal sensing to do the last, violent inch of work. And that changes the tone on a gun deck, because when a crew believes its fire can truly stop a plane, fear becomes something else, still present, still sharp, but less helpless, less like waiting to be chosen. The miracle, however, has an industrial price tag, and this is where the war's second battlefield appears. Not sky or sea, but production lines and inspection benches. The proximity fuse isn't a single invention so much as a chain of solved problems. Miniaturized electronics, hardened vacuum tubes, reliable arming delays, seals against moisture, tolerances that can survive the monstrous acceleration of a naval gun launch, and those problems were being attacked under Merle Tuve's NDRC Section T, and then at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, with the Navy leaning in through men like Parsons and through Bureau of Ordnance pressure that turns laboratory success into factory output. There had already been proof in controlled conditions. August 1942, Chesapeake Bay, USS Cleveland, firing proximity-fused 5-inch rounds at radio-controlled drones, destroying targets with shocking efficiency. And that kind of result is what gave Washington the courage to scale up. But combat is the final judge, and Guadalcanal is where the judge banged the gavel. Even the date is a reminder of how war stories get tangled. Bombardment in the early hours, return and recovery, attack shortly after. Some records tie the sequence to 5th January, others to 6th January, depending on how the ship's clocks and reports were kept. But the chain of events is consistent, and the point is the same. 4 ICD-3A Val dive bombers, a departing aircraft, a burst so close it tore the plane apart, and the first verified combat success of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire. Now the demands begin, quietly at first, then louder, as fleet commanders hear whispers that a new fuse turns near misses into kills. Supply officers ask how many are available. Gunnery schools ask what to teach. And back in the States, managers stare at quotas and failure rates, because a weapon that is good enough, in theory, is worthless if it cannot arrive by the thousands in forward magazines. Secrecy complicates everything. Crates moved under extra guard, paperwork coded, training restricted to need to know, even language policed so that proximity is never said in the wrong room. Yet the Pacific won't wait, and Japanese air attacks won't pause while America perfects its new tool. And so as 1943 grinds forward, the VT fuse begins its life the way many decisive wartime technologies do. Rationed, guarded, allocated to the most threatened ships, and introduced into crews who are told essentially, trust this, don't talk about it, use it where it can't be captured. For the men who watched the Val fall into the Solomon Sea, it is still a single image, a single burst that seemed to happen in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. But for Parsons and the people he reports to, it is already turning into a plan. Expand distribution, tighten doctrine, protect secrecy, and prepare for the day when the enemy's air attacks intensify so brutally that the fleet will need every advantage it can manufacture. 12th of June, 1944, southeastern England. The dusk has that uneasy summer softness, hedgerows darkening, telephone wires humming faintly, when Captain Arthur Tom Haynes of an anti-aircraft battery hears a new sound rolling in from the channel. Not the deep drone of bombers, but a buzzing, grinding mechanical snarl that seems to ride on the air itself. And when the first V1 comes into view, it looks like a crude, angry thing, short wings, pulse jet coughing flame, skimming inland at treetop height like a weapon with no pilot to fear death. The gun crews swing their 90mm pieces by instinct, predictors chattering as if arithmetic alone can catch a target that never flinches. And for months the frustration has been the same. Shells burst behind, above, below, the V1 keeps going, and every miss is measured in London streets and burning roofs. But tonight, there's a new instruction whispered down the chain in careful language. Special fuses, tight control, don't waste them, and the first rounds go up in a clean, disciplined pattern. You can feel the shift in the men's posture as the gunnery officer calls corrections, because he isn't asking them to time the sky anymore. He's asking them to put shells near the target and let the fuse do the last, invisible work. A burst blossoms close to the V1's path, and the flying bomb jolts as if slapped, its course bending, then breaking, the pulse jet's harsh buzz collapsing into a stuttering whine before it drops in a crooked dive and detonates harmlessly in open ground. And the crew's reaction is the same as it had been on Helena. A half-second of stunned silence, then a surge of belief that feels almost dangerous, because belief spreads faster than supply. In the weeks that follow, that belief becomes policy under pressure. The combined chiefs of staff, forced by the reality that the enemy is already raining pilotless weapons on ports and cities, begins loosening the old over water-only leash, first in narrow corridors of defense and then wider, because secrecy matters less when defeat is louder. And as the VT Fuze moves onto land, it brings the same paradox it carried in ship magazines. It is both miracle and ration, the kind of advantage you can feel slipping away each time a shell leaves a barrel. 6 months later, 16th December 1944, the Ardennes. The forest is a black tangle under low cloud, snow crusted hard enough to squeak under boots. And near Bastogne, an American artillery forward observer, Captain John Jack McKenna, collar up against the cold, watches German infantry pushing through white fields in tight groups, confident in weather and darkness, confident that spotting planes are grounded and that shells will thud into frozen earth and throw dirt instead of death. The radio crackles, McKenna gives the grid, and behind him 105mm howitzers begin to fire with a rhythm that sounds like doors slamming in a long hallway. In earlier months, timed airbursts had been rare and risky, and contact bursts wasted fragments into snow. But now the shells arrive and detonate not on impact, not too high but just above the ground in the space where men breathe and move, turning the air itself into shrapnel. McKenna hears the change before he fully understands it. The flat, violent crack of an airburst, the way it spreads like a tearing sheet rather than a punch. And through binoculars he sees German squads fold, not dramatically, but suddenly, as if the field has decided to bite back. Later, generals would argue over what won the Battle of the Bulge: fuel, weather, stubborn defense. But inside the army, the VT Fuze earned a kind of grim legend, and Patton himself would later call it the funny Fuze, writing that it had won the battle for them. The sort of statement soldiers repeat because it feels true at the foxhole level, even when historians keep their pencils cautious. And while that new airburst is shredding winter fields in Europe, the Pacific is preparing its own final exam. Spring 1945, off Okinawa, where radar screens glow green in dim CICs, and the sea is crowded with ships that cannot hide, carriers, transports, ammo ships, and where the enemy's answer to America's industrial weight is no longer the elegant dive bomber, but the kamikaze, a human-guided missile that doesn't care about flak patterns or near misses. On a destroyer radar picket station, one of the loneliest jobs in the fleet, a lieutenant junior grade stands at the bridge wing with salt stinging his face, staring at a horizon that looks too empty to be trusted, while below him the ship's 5-inch 38 mounts track targets you can't yet see, guided by radar and the Mark 37 director, their crews already sweating in the gun houses. The first bogey call comes fast, then another, then the kind that makes every man's stomach tighten. Multiple fast movers, low, closing. The captain orders maximum fire, and the 5-inch guns begin to hammer with that deep, steady cadence that feels like the ship's heartbeat, each round carrying what sailors still sometimes call the magic fuse. Except now it isn't magic, it's doctrine. Radar-directed 5-inch with VT, the backbone of fleet air defense. And when the kamikazes break from cloud and begin their dives, you see the difference in the air. Bursts appear nearer, tighter, like invisible hands are placing them, and aircraft that would once have ridden through flak now shudder, lose wings, cartwheel into the sea in sudden white geysers. It's not enough. No weapon makes a suicide attack easy to stop, but it is the difference between being helpless and having a chance, and the Navy's own histories of the Okinawa fight would later emphasize that layered defense, with 5-inch guns firing lethal VT ammunition as a centerpiece, because nothing else in the fleet could throw so much effective steel so far, so quickly. By the end of the war, Dahlgren's own retrospective would put a hard number on what the gunners felt in their bones. That VT-fused anti-aircraft fire had reached a success rate far beyond the old era of timed guesses. And the line from that first burst off Guadalcanal to the picket line off Okinawa becomes clear in the lived experience of men who never met. A loader on Helena in January 1943. A British gun crew swatting V-1s in 1944. An artillery observer at Bastogne, a destroyer man bracing for impact while the director screams corrections, all of them connected by a tiny radio set spinning inside a shell, detonating at the moment proximity becomes fatal. 6 April 1945, off Okinawa. The sea is deceptively calm in the early light, but the calm is only the stage dressing for a day the fleet will remember as a test of endurance. As a radar picket destroyer rides alone on the outer ring, with her antennas turning like nervous hands, and Ensign Paul Mercer, 22, face still soft in the way youth looks unfair in war, stands in the dim combat information center, watching a scope bloom with returns that shouldn't be there, too many, too fast, coming in low where radar has to fight the curve of the Earth. The talkers' voices are sharp now, the kind that slice through fatigue. Multiple bogies, bearing, range, closing, and Mercer's pencil scratches numbers onto a greaseboard while the ship vibrates with speed and the Mark 37 director above begins to swing as if it can smell the threat. Topside, the 5-inch 38 mounts are already trained, and below in the magazines, a chief has the VT rounds brought up in a controlled rush. Each shell, a steel cylinder with a nose that contains what sailors still half-jokingly call the brain, even if they're not supposed to say that out loud. The first aircraft appears as a dark fleck skimming the horizon, then another. Then the sunlight catches wing surfaces and you realize they're not scouting. They're committed, diving in with the ruthless geometry of kamikaze runs, and the ship's captain makes the only decision there is. Open fire at maximum effective range, throw everything into the air, and build a wall. The 5-inch guns begin their heavy, measured hammering, the mounts recoiling and returning like pistons, and Mercer hears the director officer's corrections. Deflection, elevation, fuse setting handled automatically now, while his mind keeps trying to picture what the shell is doing after it leaves the barrel, spinning so hard it should tear itself apart, yet somehow staying alive long enough to listen for a target and decide when closeness becomes fatal. The first near airburst looks like any other puff of smoke until you realize where it is, too near the plane to be luck. And then the second comes closer still, and the aircraft shudders as if struck by an invisible fist. Fragments punching through skin and spar, the engine coughing, the nose dipping. It doesn't always work. Another attacker slips through the pattern so low you can see the glare of its canopy. And every man in CIC understands that even perfect technology cannot guarantee a stop against pilots who don't intend to survive. But the difference is that the ship now gets multiple chances, not one, because the shell no longer needs perfect time-of-flight arithmetic to kill, only proximity. And in those frantic minutes, the VT fuse becomes not a scientific marvel, but an emotional sensation. A thin layer of hope you can hear in the sound of the barrage. Because each burst that blossoms close feels like the fleet's hands tightening around the attacker before impact. On the picket line, the air fills with competing noises. The deep boom of 5-inch, the sharper chatter of 40mm, the angry ripping of 20mm. And then, between salvos, Mercer hears the sound everyone dreads. The rising, descending engine note of a plane that has found its line. Someone yells, "Close aboard." And the ship seems to crouch as if it can duck, and Mercer's stomach drops because he knows what impact looks like, what burning avgas looks like, what the next 30 seconds can do to steel and bodies. The director officer calls another solution, and the 5-inch mount fires again, VT rounds arcing out in a last, disciplined throw, and one of them bursts so near the attacker that the aircraft's wing appears to fold, not gracefully, but violently, the plane cartwheeling into the sea in a white explosion that rains spray across the ship's bow. Men shout, not in celebration now, but in raw survival relief, because the kill is not a point on a scoreboard. It is the absence of impact, the continuation of breath. Later, when the action eases enough for anyone to think, Mercer will learn that the logic behind this hearing shell had begun years earlier with a physicist named Merle Tuve and an NDRC group known as Section T, then moved under the urgent industrial discipline of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where the proximity fuse ceased being a clever circuit and became a mass-produced device that could survive the monstrous acceleration of a gun launch. Those names were never spoken on the picket line in 1945, but their fingerprints were in every VT round handled with care in the magazine. And the war's strange timing means that while Mercer is fighting for survival in the Pacific, the origin story of the VT fuse is still locked behind classification stamps. Back in January 1943, the light cruiser USS Helena had fired 5-inch shells fitted with the new VT fuse near Guadalcanal and achieved the first successful combat use, bringing down at least one withdrawing Japanese Aichi D-3A Val with an airburst so close it looked almost impossible. The fleet treated that success like a fragile secret, restricting early use to overwater engagements to prevent capture, and then, only as necessity forced the issue, letting it spread to Britain's V-1 defense and to US Army artillery in Europe when the stakes outweighed secrecy. By the summer of 1945, ships like Mercer's are expending VT ammunition at a rate the 1943 planners would have found terrifying, and the factories and depots behind the scenes, dozens of them, coordinated in a logistics chain that spans oceans, are as much a part of the weapon as the circuit in the nose. Each time a shell leaves the barrel, it's not only steel and explosive, it's the cumulative work of laboratories, inspection benches, and the quiet men like Parsons, who rode into combat to verify that the thing actually worked when people were trying to kill you. Then the horizon shifts again, as it always does in war. August 1945 brings surrender announcements crackling over ship radios, bringing men onto decks with stunned faces, and in the weeks that follow, a different kind of silence begins to lift. The silence of secrecy, as officers who have carried the VT label, like contraband, start to realize that soon, finally, they will be allowed to say what saved them, to tell the story of the shell that seemed to burst at exactly the right moment, and to admit that the magic wasn't magic at all, but a new way of measuring distance in the sky and turning that distance into death before the enemy could reach you. 2 September 1945, Western Pacific. The war ends not with a clean silence, but with a strange, disbelieving quiet that settles over ships like morning fog, and on steel decks, men stand in loose clusters, listening to a shipboard radio crackle out the news from Tokyo Bay, faces slack with exhaustion and relief, hands still stained with grease and cordite as if the body refuses to accept that the drill is over. In the days that follow, as task forces begin the long logistical unwind, ammo expenditures tallied, magazines inspected, equipment secured, officers who spent years treating two letters like contraband find themselves hesitating, then finally letting the words out in protected briefings. The VT fuse, the proximity fuse, the shell that could detonate when it came close enough to something metal and moving. Among them is Captain, later remembered as RADM, Cap T, William Sterling Parsons, the Bureau of Ordnance man who rode aboard USS Helena in early 1943 to witness what secrecy demanded be witnessed firsthand, and the moment he had watched, Helena's aft 5-inch battery dropping a Japanese dive bomber near Guadalcanal with the second of 3 salvos on January 5, 1943, now sits in a filing system that can finally begin to breathe, because the war that required the secret has ended. In Washington, the machinery of disclosure moves in its own deliberate tempo. Wartime technical reports and Bureau of Ordnance histories begin to circulate more widely, and the public story starts to form, not as a single dramatic announcement, but as a controlled unveiling of how a small radar set inside a fuse could sense reflections and trigger detonation at the lethal moment, making anti-aircraft and artillery fire far more effective than old contact or time fuses. Even the name that had seemed so ordinary, VT, gets explained after years of deliberate vagueness. Variable time, a label chosen to sound like mundane fuse jargon without hinting at proximity sensing, coined inside the Bureau of Ordnance's R&D leadership specifically to be descriptive, yet misleading enough to protect the method. For the scientists and engineers, the post-war months are a different kind of exhaustion. The release of pressure after years when failure meant more ships burning and more cities hit. Merle-Tuve's Section T and the network that grew into and around Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory can finally be discussed with fewer locked doors, and the story that had lived in compartmentalized fragments, physicists designing circuits, industrial teams shock-hardening miniature vacuum tubes, ordnance officers translating laboratory promise into fleet procedure, begins to appear as one of the war's defining mobilizations of science and manufacturing. Numbers emerge that sailors never saw while they were alive to the danger. By war's end, millions upon millions of fuses had been produced, a scale that explains how something born as a guarded curiosity could end up as routine ammunition on radar picket stations and in European gun belts, and why veterans in two theaters could describe the same sensation, a burst appearing impossibly close to the target, turning near enough into decisive destruction. And as the accounts spread, the weapon's battlefield footprint becomes clearer in the way only hindsight can make clear. The proximity fuse's role in helping anti-aircraft defenses against the V1 campaign, when paired with modern fire control systems. Its brutal effectiveness in airburst artillery against infantry formations in Europe, and its significance in Pacific Fleet defense when kamikaze attacks tried to overwhelm ships with sheer willpower and speed. Effects that wartime leaders like Vannevar Bush later emphasized when explaining why this invention mattered at the strategic level, not just the tactical one. In the fleet, though, the story remains stubbornly human, grounded in sensation. A gun captain remembering how VT bursts looked placed rather than guessed. A director officer remembering the confidence that crept into a crew once they believed their barrage could actually stop a fast mover. A magazine chief remembering the early rules. Use where duds couldn't be captured, account for every round, because secrecy had been as much a part of the fuse as the circuitry. And if you listen closely to those recollections, you can still hear the first moment of belief forming in combat, because that moment never really belonged to Washington or to laboratories. It belonged to the crews who had to trust it while someone was trying to kill them. Years later, in museums and collections, you can look at a cutaway proximity fuse and see the neat, compact guts of it, components that look almost innocent compared to the violence they were built to survive. And it becomes easier to understand why sailors called it magic before they understood the science. Not because they believed in miracles, but because they had watched a problem that had always felt insoluble. Hitting a fast aircraft with timed bursts becomes suddenly, brutally solvable when the shell itself took over the last decision. The war film version of this story would end with a single triumphant burst and a cheering gun deck. But the real ending is quieter and heavier. The slow realization that modern war had crossed a threshold where tiny circuits and code names could determine whether ships lived or died, where secrecy could shape doctrine as surely as steel-shaped hulls, and where a pair of letters, VT, could be carried across oceans in locked crates and guarded speech, then finally spoken aloud once the shooting stopped. Not as magic, but as the name of a weapon that changed what it meant to defend the sky.